think I will stop there, and I will now invite our next, and that is Dr. Odinye. Odinye, I also got her contacts from the person who also contacted me with, connected me to Anyetan. So she is, of course, an expert in this area, since she's the deputy director for the Center of Gender Studies in Nnamdi Azikiwe University. So, Dr. Ifeoma Odinye is an associate professor in the Department of English Language and Literature, but she's also the deputy director of the Center for Gender Studies. So she's also an expert in that area. She, of course, graduated with a first class in 2006 and had his master's in Chinese philosophy, which is quite interesting, at Beijing, China. Okay, so that is a very powerful background, and I'm sure with that background, she will be able to have a landscape of epistemic landscape to be able to discuss this topic. And her topic that she's going to talk about is what she called the politics of bodily autonomy, dignity, and respect in African philosophical conceptualization. Please join me and welcome Dr. Odinye.
Yes, good evening, everyone. I really have to, turn off my video so that I wouldn't affect, my network wouldn't be affected. So I'm deeply sorry for that. Now, I really want to, it is indeed a great honor to speak, in this honorable academic gathering. And I deeply thank all the organizers for this wonderful, wonderful opportunity. Before I am going to speak on the topic, the politics of bodily autonomy, dignity, and respect in African philosophical conceptualizations. But before I do this, I want to make a remark. Social consciousness is structured by cultural imperatives and modulated by the ever-shifting local and global experiences. If I will borrow from, the ideology of Obioma Nemeka. Now, before delving into my topic, it becomes important to know that this is a dicey topic, a very sensitive one, in the world and the global South. And then we cannot talk about bodily autonomy without, asking what gender violence is. How does gender violence constitute an infringement of bodily autonomy of both male and female when we talk about genders? Now, the implication is this, because I really have to strike a balance so that I wouldn't, filing in the lopsided discussion on gender-based violence, which may have, destructive consequences, in the nearest future. Now, the implication is that as a dicey topic, it becomes important that I state a fact, which is a contemporary trend that should be looked into for every person to take into cognizance. And I said, we see an abuse of rights in defense of rights. That is what we are encountering right now. We see an abuse of rights in the defense of rights. The implication is that in the contemporary era, we tend to protect our female children and keep a blind eye on the oppressive tendencies that affect our male children. Thus, I would like to go to the concept of my topic, which is bodily autonomy. And when I would try to strike a balance between the male and the female gender, the implication is that I'm going to explore, the concepts or the infringements on bodily autonomy from these two perspectives, from the female gender perspective and then from the male gender, perspective. Now, when we talk about bodily autonomy, it simply has to do with concept. But it has a slogan, a simple slogan, which indicates my body, my choice. So the implication is that my body is me, my body is my own. It's all about power and it's all about agency, who controls the body, which is very important. So the implication is that bodily autonomy is about choice and it's about dignity. The dignity I offer to my body, the dignity I want people to offer to my body. So the implication is that there must be consent in any decision, in any behavioral acts that must be exerted by an individual. Now, we say that no one has the right to violate the rights or the autonomy or bodily integrity of anyone else, be it children or adults. So when we talk about bodily autonomy, the implication is that it is a right to make decisions about your body, your life, your future without coercion, influence, or violence of any form. But when we talk about bodily autonomy, it has to do, situated within 8 brackets according to a given cultural context. We have to put that into consideration. Now, when we talk about bodily autonomy too, it has to do with the capacity of individuals to make decisions or exercise decisions about themselves in sexual relations, in behavioral, actions regarding maybe use of contraceptives, that have, had to do with that or have to do with their, with their bodies and the rest. Now, it also becomes important that we cannot delve into gender, into bodily autonomy without trying to comprehend what gender-based violence is. And then when we talk about gender-based violence, our interest should not be, impinged or should not focus only on the female gender. Because when we talk about lopsided ideologies or empirical studies, that have been talking about oppressive tendencies from the aspects, of the female gender, it becomes important that it is 2 sides of the opposite coin. The implication is that once we agitate so much on the other, it overturns and it becomes a problem. So that is why I am proposing some concepts within African, philosophical undertones to see how we could create a balance that would help the society. So I'm not going into that right now. Now, I try to say we cannot understand bodily autonomy without understanding gender-based violence. And that is to say, that is to ask, how does gender-based violence constitute an infringement of bodily autonomy for these genders? Now, globally examined, we can say that gender-based violence manifests, in different forms, such as rape, which is an infringement of bodily autonomy. So when we talk about rape is a universal pattern of violence. So rape could happen to a male or a female. It could happen to a child or an adult. Now, the implication is that once there is no consent or a kind of manipulation because of the child's lack of knowledge, be it a male or a female, it is an infringement. So from the part of the adult, if there is no consent because the adult is knowledgeable about the act of rape, there is no consent in terms of sexual relationship, it becomes an infringement on bodily autonomy. Now, we also have domestic violence. So when we talk about domestic violence, we have the verbal aspect of it and the physical aspect, which is battery. So when we talk about the verbal aspect of it, it could also be focused or sift out from male or female, experiences. So when you talk about verbal violence, it has to do with what I call ego shaming. So what is ego shaming? Within marital space, for example, when a man, is not maybe happy, about a woman's body, it becomes a kind of ego shaming. It has a psychological undertone that could hamper the psychological, stability of that female individual within the marriage space. Another side could be of bodily autonomy, which is also psychological in nature, could be sift from the male perspective. When a female feels that a husband could not perform, in quotes, and then uses that, to chart him or to, actually cause a kind of psychological trend that will make the man to be unstable. It becomes a kind of infringement, bodily infringement, because anything that affects in terms of relation to the body that affects a personality within a given space is also part of that. So a man has to take decisions of how he sees himself and how he acts. So I should not be impinged upon. So we also look at sexual assault. There are different levels of sexual assault, which also has psychological and physical implications. So it is an infringement, of bodily autonomy. So we have body shaming. I think I've mentioned that with ego shaming. Then we have what we call female circumcision, or what the Westerners called, genital mutilation, female genital mutilation. And again, I am bringing a contemporary trend which is really creeping into the society because of diversities, in terms of oppressive tendencies that are affecting the male gender. Now we see what we call circumcision. Most females are really subtly agitating that male circumcision is also part of it. If female circumcision could also be what we call a kind of bodily infringement on bodily autonomy, but that should be left for another day for discussion. Now, we also have gender inequality in terms of behavioral roles. Certain roles had been, women had been, cloned to behave in a particular way, the same thing with female gender and the same thing with the male gender. Now, we have hit so much on the aspect of the female gender without knowing the implication of psychological roles that men have been, accustomed or imbued or have been trained to practice. So the implication is that how can you tell a man not to cry when his whole system is overwhelmed by pain? It is a gender role. A man should feel strong. A man should be dominant. These things are actually impinging on the psychological and well-being of the male gender. I'll talk about that later. So we talk about stereotype. I think it's also connected to body shaming. And we talk about discrimination. It's also discrimination in terms of male child syndrome, within the ideology of patriarchal mentality. So when we talk about male child syndrome from the female, gender perspective, it becomes important that for the fact you're a woman, for the fact you are not a man, it has the bodily autonomy of influence changes your personality if care is not taken. And that is why most most feminists are still agitating. Are saying, why you be fair, all these things. But the implication is not all just that. That is why I'm going to introduce, from looking at, I'm going to introduce a centralized African conceptualized philosophy that will help to unite what the feminist mentality and the masculinist mentality, because I'm going to introduce what although it has been existing, the masculinism as a form of advocacy for men in terms of the oppression that are going in the hands of women. Now, I say we can't explore gender-based violence as a form of infringement of bodily autonomy from African perspective without understanding the scope of gender studies. The implication is that gender studies, is an interdisciplinary, academic field that examines the social, cultural, historical constructions and experiences of gender. In essence, we talk about women's studies, queer studies, literary and social, theories and other theories that I might not be able to explore. Now, within these gender studies, there are discussions on how gender informs people's identities, the intersection of gender and sexuality, and how gender norms and social political structures influence one another. Interestingly, we can say that gender studies, gives researchers the drive to examine the relationship between gender and power dynamics. And sincerely speaking, I would say that this major drive or interest connects significantly with my topic of discussion entitled The Politics of Bodily Autonomy, Dignity, and Respect in African Philosophical Conceptualizations. I have to also state that in any discussion on gender issues in the context of African worldview, two ideologies surface. And I say the first is ideology of power structures and influence. So this also replicates in bodily or autonomy. You must talk about the ideology from patrilineal, pattern of existence. The male had been trained, to influence, to dominate. That had been what we had been in existence within the African cultural context. So the first ideology when talking about bodily autonomy is, within the African, philosophy, is the ideology of power structures and influence, which is also taking a new trend in the contemporary era that we find ourselves. We now see men agitating subtly, not visibly anyways. Now, the second one I projected is the mentality of consistent assertiveness for liberation, what I call a revolutionary ideology spurred by repressed violations. This is where I'm mostly concerned about bodily autonomy, because when you talk about rape, we concentrate so much on female, oppressive tendencies without looking at, the side of men who have been oppressed. And the implication is that in the contemporary era, there is a subtle revolutionary ideology that is poured by repressed violations. That is why we've seen reactions and counter-reactions. That is why we see evidences for psychic split and overreaction that could lead to death. I'm coming to that. Now, significantly, gender-based violence in any cultural context within the politics of bodily autonomy, dignity and respect creates, what I call a void or a vacuum, what I call a force of forced separation from reality, dreams, social connections, identities with huge consequences. So when we talk about huge consequences, we talk about consequences that affect the structural model of the mind, the id, the ego or personality of a man, and the superego, a kind of subtlety that checkmates, the ego. Now, as proposed, by Sigmund Freud. Now, the implication is that gender-based violence, as an infringement of bodily autonomy, brings a conflict, or what I call, or inherent conflicts or external conflicts, which must be combated with varied defense mechanisms as different individuals, try to protect themselves or cope with the stress of the violence, whether within the home or outside, whether it's public or private. Now, within conceived ideology of Freud's model of the mind, we have to understand that violated individuals, be it male or female, adopt different mechanisms to protect themselves, such as such mechanisms could be repression, which we are seeing from the stance of the male gender, that repress a lot, and then culminating, these things culminating into psychological disturbances that could, lead to different reactions that might not be good for the society. Now we have denial, we have projection, we have displacement, we have regression, sublimation. So there are many of them. However, we must understand that these defenses have both internal and external consequences within a given cultural context, therefore eliciting different reactions with neurotic implications, psychic splits, disillusionment, death, or extreme reaction with negative social impacts. Having said that, I will discuss African philosophical understanding of bodily autonomy, dignity, and respect within the notions of violations, under a range of perspectives rooted in cultural, historical, and social contexts. But before I begin this, it becomes important to note that we cannot visibly deny that the earliest infringement of bodily autonomy within African cultural context emerged from the glorification of patrilineal and patriarchal mentality, which has led to feminist agitations. In the other way around, we can say that feminist agitations has led to masculinism, what we are subtly experiencing in this contemporary time. Now, in order to significantly explore African philosophical conceptualization conceptualizations of gender-based violence, I try to draw on diverse traditions that exist, within African social context. I looked at what I called African patrilineal conceptualization, cum patriarchal conceptualization. So when we talk about patrilineal or patriarchy, it simply means a culturally, instituted practice within Africa, solidified by an ideology or political system where men, direct women on how to live, what to do, and the rest. Now, the implication is that the idea, in fact, I will simply say that the idea that women are perceived as second-class beings, is the hallmark of this conceptualization. Therefore, this conceptualization, I would say, heightened the importance of feminist theories. So that's why we talk about right now, we are not just talking about radical feminism, which has, engulfed the African society. We are also looking at different forms of African feminisms that could be used or that have been proposed by different, individual feminists, to tackle issues of African origins. Now, the implication is this, is that we cannot conceptualize patriarchy, which hinders, we cannot under-conceptualize patriarchy, which hinders explanation of mechanisms sustaining gender inequality. What am I trying to say? What I'm trying to say is that there must be patriarchal bargain, which sees gender relations as the outcome of negotiation with public and private multidimensionalism. Now, remember, we see patriarchy as the idea that men have more power, dominance, and privilege than women. And we see it as a social system in which men, are consciously or unconsciously taught to hold positions of power in both the public and private spheres. Now, when we talk of this, within the bodily infringement of rape, you see, the patrilineal culture does something. Gives men or arrogates men the power and the dominance to have influence, sexual influence over women, with or without their consent. It was prevalent. And even within the marital spaces, these things exist. This infringement exists. A woman shouldn't, tell how she feels about her sexual drives. A woman shouldn't have, should have a peculiar sexual behavior to be seen as a nice woman. These things is a kind of infringement. Now, I said that patrilineal mentality led to feminist tendencies. So when we talk about feminist tendencies, we see I projected the Afrocentric feminism, which combines the elements of African philosophy with feminist perspectives, to analyze and address issues of gender inequality and violence. And this takes us to those gender-based violence that lead to the infringement of bodily autonomy. So the implication is that Afrocentric feminism, had been projected or is a critical issue, that intersect with various aspects of gender equality, social justice, and human rights. So from this perspective on gender-based violence, see African feminists, advocating for a kind of sexual autonomy and reproductive rights and freedom of gender-based violence. So the implication is that most of these feminists within African cultural contexts challenge harmful practices such as the female genital mutilation, which is a kind of infringement, child marriage, which we also call forced marriage without consent. A child is pushed into, a kind of influence that has many negative or oppressive undertones. We also see the bodily infringement, autonomy, a kind of infringement on bride selling, which, was prevalent in those days, and subtly people are still doing it, in the contemporary era. We also see forced sterilization, that had an infringement on women's bodily autonomy, telling a woman, how to not to express her, not just her health rights, in other spheres. Now, African feminists, address broader systemic issues in different ways. They have talked about patriarchy. They have talked about colonial legacies. They have talked about socio-economic inequalities that undermine women's autonomy and agencies, agency over their bodies from different angles, saying that once there is child marriage or forced marriage, it impinges on the psychological and physical well-being of the child. It could lead to neurotic modes. If it can even lead to mental lapses or psychic splits, it could even lead to death. So these things have been projected. But in order to strike a balance within this conceptualization, remember I said that we cannot deny the earliest infringement of bodily autonomy within African cultural contexts, without looking at how, patrilineal society actually encouraged that. That is what I call the glorification of patrilineal, patriarchal mentality in checking the oppressive tendencies of the female gender. But now, currently, we are seeing an emergence of a new trend within African cultural contexts. And this leads me to situating the concept of or ideology of masculinism, what I called African masculinism, in order to balance oppression, in order to balance my topic, the politics of bodily autonomy, because it is an ideology of two coins. You talk about a female, talk about so over lopsidedness will affect the order. Now the implication is that due to feminist agitation or advocacy, there had been a subtle projection of masculinity. So what do I mean by masculinity within that should be situated within African, philosophical conceptualization? It simply means masculinity simply means male advocacy. It could be seen as a socio-political movement that focuses on the rights, interests, and experiences of men. In essence, why female primarily, feminism, primarily addresses issues of gender inequalities and discrimination against women. African masculinism seeks to address perceived imbalances or injustices that men face in society. And this is becoming a thing of great concern because it's leading to psychic split that elicits, different reactions that could lead to death of our loved ones. And when we talk of loved ones, talk of the opposite side, the female gender. So the implication is this: this masculinity, has key aspects. So when we talk about advocacy for men, we have to look at within African cultural context, look at gender roles and stereotypes. So when we talk about masculinism often should critique, traditional gender roles and, stereotypes, that have prescribed certain behaviors, expectations, and roles for men. It must challenge the notion that men should conform to, norms or narrow definitions of masculinity, another description of masculinity, such as being strong, being dominant, and emotionally stoic, and it must advocate, for greater freedom of expression and self-definition.
Professor Odinye, please be summarizing, okay?
Okay. Within the scope of my paper, in order to balance my argument on bodily autonomy, which actually is an infringement on both, genders, I categorically mentioned that bodily autonomy is an enforced choice which has been grossly undermined and violated within gender dynamics. Then I perceive, because in your question, I really need to, I'm sorry there is no time. In your question, within the general thematic factor that have been presented for this colloquium, you say, is there an exclusive articulation of gender-based violence in African philosophy? And I said, yes. There are two exclusive, articulation. One is on the male gender side, and the other one is on the other genders. Now, I tried to perceive an exclusive articulation and to present an exclusive articulation and inadequate account of violated bodily autonomy wrapped around masculinities and queerness within African philosophical conceptualization. And I say that this is evident, in current anthropological crises and manifestations of gender-based violence in Africa. Then I also try to, mention that the interplay of exclusivity and unspeakability of gender-based violence with its traumatic effect could result to disillusionment, psychic split, extreme negative reaction, or death. And then I postulated, I would have talked about Ubuntu, but there is no time. I postulated that the implementation of interconnectedness and humanity to others in Ubuntu African philosophy as a model in interpreting gender lines will lead to liberation, empowerment, and social change. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Odinye. Thank you so much for already the chat box is filled with reactions to all the papers at large. So that is good. So we have basically 5 minutes for questions. We may not take all the questions at the same time, but we can manage to answer some and leave some till the end of the lecture today. So I call on Diana.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your insightful
personality, or perhaps the moral standing or the moral decision to say no. How can we help in such situations? What do you think can be done in such situations? Because these are issues that we have in our everyday life. We face in virtually every sphere of human life. We see a lot of children who have been abused sexually and stuff like that. So what is the place of autonomy in that regard? Thank you.
Okay, so please, Umezurike, make your question brief, and then Dr. Odinye will answer briefly, then we have to maybe...
Okay, thank you for this wonderful opportunity once again. I want to thank you for this wonderful presentation. Should I say that my own question or a comment? In the course of the presentation, you talked about how the female genital organ, how female genital organ used to be mutilated, but we have a situation whereby there's still circumcision, male circumcision. So nobody's talking about that. I think someone have actually written that. Nobody's talking about that. I think it boils down to culture, as Chimakonam once said. It has to do with culture. If we develop today and we feel that what we were doing before is not in order, so to speak, maybe because of probably what they might have said, that maybe during childbearing that could cause a problem or a complication. So that make that culture that was practiced before, and then where many people agreed before, a barbaric. So that's my question. So that makes that culture that many people were interested in before now a barbaric culture. If there's a development, there's need for development. If there's a development, then they get to understand that there's some issues arising from a particular culture. So that culture, does that make that practicing culture before a barbaric culture?
Summarize. Okay. What makes a culture barbaric?
Yes.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Odinye, please respond.
Okay. I'll respond to the first question. When I started, I defined my scope of gender-based violence. And I think every research has a scope that must be delved into. So when I talked about my body, my choice, I wasn't talking about an individual within a social space doing anything within an agreement or within a relationship, doing anything he or she wants with his or her body. That is not what I was trying to project. I talked about age bracket in terms of those ownership of the body and autonomy in terms of infringement. And I remember I mentioned rape. No one has a right to rape any, whether a child or an adult. If it is a child, you have no moral obligation. You have no moral right. If you're talking about an adult, there should be a consent. If there's no consent, it is a bodily, infringement. Now, that I think that answers the first question. So I cannot be, it cannot be a female, all of it, go into transgenderism, say my body, my choice, without looking at some social, implications of that and the constitution within a given social context. And I could remember, if I am to answer the second question, he talked about how do, children, protect themselves from rape. Whether we like it or not, this is a serious, issue that is really facing the contemporary era within the world and within African cultural context. I say the first thing, I talked about social consciousness, which is very important. I'm very glad in most schools and in different families, teachers and mothers are telling their children, you shouldn't be taught in certain ways, you shouldn't be, these things are very important. Social consciousness and familiarization of ideologies should be, instituted or taught to our young ones so they could speak up. Now, the problem I have is not specifically because we are concentrating so much on the female gender, neglecting the oppressing tendencies that have wrapped the male gender. Daily, young males are raped and they could not speak because we do not have a culture of, teaching them that they should know this in terms of, bodily autonomy, in terms of infringement. Now,
Dr. Odinye, you cannot clarify everything here. We just wanted you to give some basic responses. The argument and discussion and conversation continues. So maybe you have another minute to round up that answer, but let's take a question from Amara. Then you can now round up your first answer and then answer. Please, Amara.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My question is very simple. What is the role of context in your lecture, especially when you talked about child marriage and rest of them? What role does context play in your lecture? Thank you.
So when you talk about context, it also has to, we are talking about African cultural context. So within the African cultural context, we are looking at anthropological crises and manifestations that could be seen from daily experiences and social spaces or digital spaces that we encounter on a daily basis. Now, the implication is that I cannot talk about bodily, bodily autonomy and its infringement without looking at these spaces, because we could virtually see the happenings, that have been happening, that have been, visible to us, to everyone. So when you talk of context, it has different undertones, but it depends on my specialized focus and then how I want to approach it. Is it from different African conceptualizations, on how to, manage the link between, African Afrocentric feminism and patriarchal or patrilineal mentality. So when I remember a question someone asked about patrilineal society. I decided to make this in order to understand that you cannot talk about African patrilineal context without seeing the influence of patriarchy within patrilineal focus. These are my perceptions, and they are very clear. So you cannot tell me that you are talking, there are special roles. There are issues of dominance in terms of power relations that have been categorically imposed on the patrilineal stance. So when I talk about, for me to explicate African conceptualization in relation to connection or in connection to African feminism, I must talk about the patriarchal mentality, which had impeded on the welfare or the well-being of the female gender, which has led to various agitations or advocacies. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Be sure that the answers will not satisfy everybody. It is just like when you are writing a thesis or when you are writing a book and people are reading it and some are getting so, charged up with every claim that is on the text. So that's just what is happening on this platform. So just feel okay with it. It's normal, but we can't provide all arguments on this platform. And those of us who are presented will also have to go back and reflect using the questions to look again on our claims. That is the essence of this conversation. So with that, we'll round up this paper and then we'll go for the final paper.